South Central College's new president has officially begun after the retirement of the longtime president. Dr. Ritu Raju has worked in higher education since 2006 and comes to South Central College after serving as president of Gateway Technical College in Wisconsin since 2023. Dr. Raju has a background as an English and communications professor before moving to the administrative side of higher ed. She says the first week is focusing on learning about the area and the community, making relationships with the rest of the Minnesota state system.
When you come into an institution that's already doing really good things and has a really solid foundation, the goal is to build on that, right? And the goal is to find new ways to serve the community.
Dr. Raju takes over for Dr. Annette Parker, who retired after serving as the college's president for over a decade.